to our examination of the life cycles of churches, and particularly to the life cycle of Christ Presbyterian Church in High Point, North Carolina. We have seen that while the stages of birth and vitality at Crestwood were strong during the 1950s and 60s, the period of stability and equilibrium that is often quite long in many churches was cut short by three major periods of conflict in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that reduced the congregation's membership and mission to a mere shell of what it had been. By the late 90s, the church had shrunk to such a degree that they could no longer sustain themselves on the offerings of church members. It was at this point that the church officially entered the period of realized decline as they reached out to Salem Presbytery for help. Salem's approach was to start a new church development by changing the church's name from Crestwood to Christ, calling a young and energetic new pastor, and giving $25,000 a year in financial support. The Reverend Ben Trawick was called in 1999 to lead this new beginning, albeit with a now old building in desperate need of repair and updating.
Well, my first impressions when I arrived to interview on site were that it was going to be a daunting undertaking. The facility was in poor condition. Everything was very, very dated. So the sanctuary had seafoam green shag carpeting and gold pew cushions and like 1970s wood paneling. It was like stepping into a time capsule. The Sunday school wing was shut down completely. The rooms were just being used for storage. So the first Sunday, as I recall it, I was excited to meet the congregation and to start this new process. And the attendance at that first service was something like 15 to 17 people. It was under 20. And that was another wake-up call as to just how far we would have to come with the process, because a pastor's first Sunday, one anticipates as large a turnout as you may see for some time. Afterward, I was almost at the point of tears. It was just a discouraging day. The very first thing we did was to begin to pull together plans for a thoroughgoing renovation of the facility. Paint, carpet, some architectural alterations to make it feel more open, more inviting, more welcoming, and more current.
By 2002, progress had been made.
From that initial Sunday of fewer than 20 people, we grew to have a sustained, regular Sunday morning attendance of 50 to 60. And so that was exciting and energizing.
What I loved about going back to church there was how diverse it had become. It was very much more racially diverse than it had been previously, and I loved that.
That Crestwood area of High Point had over the years become racially diverse, and it seemed inappropriate to have a congregation that was not racially diverse serving a neighborhood that was quite racially diverse. And so we tried to reach out to our neighbors and to invite participation, and some families chose to join the congregation, and that just began to build an energy. And I think there was very much a sense that if the church had a future, it needed to be a racially diverse future. And a lot of people bought into that vision, and that was very exciting.
But Ben could not afford to stay.
The church's means were so limited that I was brought in at what was very close to the Presbyterian minimum salary at the time. My wife was in school working on a PhD. There were just no means, with all of the work that needed to be done. I honestly reached a point where it was just not financially tenable to remain there.
I was the interim pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church from 2003 to 2005. I arrived right after Ben Trawick left. We had about 60 on the roll, 35 to 40 in worship. The Presbyterian home was a huge mission for our church, and we had quite a few members from the Presbyterian home. We had a lot of older members, not many children. The finances were very strained, but things were plugging along. And quite frankly, I was optimistic when I left. I felt like things were going to be okay. I pastored 2 churches down in the eastern part of the state during that time, so I was not in touch with Christ Presbyterian Church. And I happened to show up at worship the Sunday before they closed, and I was absolutely shocked that this was going to happen. I think one of the biggest things that happened was the old Presbyterian home closed. River Landing opened. A lot of the folks went out to River Landing, and it was hard for them to get back to Christ Presbyterian. But those folks loved that church, and they loved each other. It was a wonderful congregation.
I could tell that it was on decline because we were always like associated with Presbyterian homes. So we always had like an older population anyway. But then when I started going back, I could just see that this was happening. Yeah, I kind of knew where it was headed, but we tried so hard for a lot of years to keep it going. We just couldn't make it.
A congregation makes the decision to close. They probably do it in consultation with members of the presbytery, but the session of a congregation makes the ultimate decision to close, and that's what happened at Christ Presbyterian. The session voted that it was time for their congregation, their church, to close.
Growing up in the church and then seeing the church slowly decline in membership and having to eventually close the church was pretty hard. It was, a huge chapter of my life. Like I said, my faith journey began at that church, so it left me, kind of wondering a lot. I felt so bad for my mom because she was the clerk of session at the time, and that she was having to do all of that and go to all these presbytery meetings and really make those hard decisions with the session. And I remember I would call her a lot, and she would be very upset about the decision that they were going to have to make.
The presbytery appoints an administrative commission made up of members of the presbytery, both ministers of word and sacrament and ruling elders, and together they work to do a number of tasks that are necessary for the closing of a congregation. Making sure that the members of the congregation can find membership in other churches, other Presbyterian churches, if they so desire. Another task is providing for some sort of final celebration worship service for that congregation. And then there's a lot of financial and property tasks that are involved, administering the finances of the church, dispersing that money, paying any final debts and bills that the congregation owes, and also deciding what to do with the church property. One of the challenges with the property at Christ Presbyterian Church was that it wasn't in particularly good shape. So there were a lot of repairs that were constantly needing to be made. There was just a lot of work that was going to need to be done. One of the other challenges that came with closing the Christ Presbyterian Church was just the grief of the congregation. I think one thing that stood out to me about this small church is that it was different than a lot of small churches in that a lot of small churches you think of as family churches. Lots of people maybe in those small congregations are related to one another. But that wasn't the case at Christ Presbyterian Church. It was a small church made up of really disparate individuals that had become a family just because of their relation to each other in this congregation. And so I think there was a lot of grief, as their numbers dwindled, but as they still were so connected to each other.
I'm very proud of my mom and my father for doing that and making those hard decisions. And really, our church, even though we weren't happy that we wouldn't be meeting together as one anymore, we knew it was the right decision for one another.
I cried through the whole last service at Christ Presbyterian. We all did. It was final. It felt so final. But on the other hand, I had become so close with all of the church members that I knew it wasn't goodbye. It was, it was more of just a closing of a chapter. But it was sad. Even thinking back, it makes me emotional.
That last service was one that, it was so bittersweet. I remember walking in and there was so many cars in the parking lot and I was like, what's going on? Like, I know it's our last service, but we only have like upwards of 20 people at max on Sundays. And it was so nice to walk in and see Clarice Hutchins' daughter at the service, and she was the reason that our family joined the church. So that was just like a very full circle moment for our family, and to have the Vitello family sitting in front of us, who they sat in front of us for years, the Rushes, all these families that we grew up with and had these strong connections with were there, and paying tribute to one another in that. And really, like that Sunday, looking at our Bibles and our hymnals and seeing the names that they were donated in honor and memory of, and remembering those people. It was a hard service for all of us. I remember we were all very emotional, but it was a beautiful closing service for all of us. I remember I walked down the education hallway and looked at the Sunday school room that I was first taught in, and looked at the nursery that I would help keep. And it was just a bittersweet moment, but I knew that it was a moment that would help us all grow in our faith. It's hard to drive by it still and see that we're not going there on Sundays anymore. That church has rallied around us so well as a family. With Mom's passing, they came out of the woodwork to help us, and I think we still have meals in our freezer from her passing in May. So
when Brian's mom passed, when she got sick, I reached out to everybody to let them know. But
of course, we lost Eileen last year, and that was devastating. So
the Lord provides us in amazing ways, and provided us a great way to find a new church home in Jamestown, and we still have our love of Christ Presbyterian at Jamestown Presbyterian, which is really nice.
So about 2 or 3 years ago, Salem Presbytery decided that it was time to sell the property. And it's been on the market for 18 months or more, but we finally have received a good offer on the property, and we hope to be able to close within the next 4 months. What we are hoping to do with the proceeds from the sale of the property, the first project is to fund a position at the presbytery level for this person to be able to go and work with churches who might be in the same situation that Christ was during its years of decline. And the idea is to help them envision maybe a new future or new opportunities with partnerships with other churches. But this person's primary job will be going in and helping these churches who are at risk, shall we say. This person is going to be focused on the churches that were in similar situations as Christ, with the hopes of bringing a resurrection. The money from the sale of the property is what's making this possible. And so I really do see that part of the legacy of the folks of Crestwood and Christ Presbyterian is this investing into the future possibilities of other churches. And that's a real blessing.
I remember one of our last meetings with all of the elders, Chipper said something that has stuck with me to this day, and I'll never forget it. He said, the church isn't about a building. It's about one person, two people coming together to worship God, and that's what church is. It is not a building. It is not even necessarily it has to be a whole big congregation. It doesn't have to be a preacher sitting up at a pulpit. It's worshiping God. That's church. And I'll never forget that.
We have reviewed the life cycle of churches, and we've looked at Crestwood Christ Presbyterian as an example of that process in microcosm. My hopes for this brief documentary are that we see closed churches less as a failure and celebrate them more for the good that flowed from them during their lives. At the same time, as more and more churches enter the phases of decline and realize decline, that we look more closely at how we approach efforts of revitalization. With the concurrent decline in presbytery funds, financial support will only become more difficult to offer. We may need to ask hard questions about the use of these funds and look at other ways, either of allowing nearly defunct churches to close or new approaches, such as a presbytery consultant to work with churches who are willing to do the hard work of regaining health and vitality. It is true that all churches die, and some are kept alive too long by means of artificial life support. But it is also true that many churches may be dying sooner than necessary when the right interventions can be taken to revive and revitalize them. I pray that this video series will prompt and encourage even wider and deeper focus on these questions.